I'm no expert. I'm just a guy splaining stuff. You know, sometimes things look pretty complicated, and you wish you had some clarity. Hey, I try to make it simple. I'm just a guy splaining stuff. Let's dive in. Let's splain compression. All right, we're into our first demonstration of compression. And we're using the stock compressor inside Studio One. We've talked about most of the controls earlier, but let me walk you through briefly. Here's the threshold, and watch the amount of compression happening. Remember, as we lower the threshold, more of the audio is above it, consequently, more of it is subject to compression. Here's the ratio. You see it go up and down. The higher the number, the more we're going to compress. The lower the number, the less compression. And here's a control that we didn't talk about earlier. It's called the knee. And what the knee is it makes an adjustment to the angle or the attack of the ratio. So as we move this, it's either what we call a soft knee or a hard knee. And when it's at a hard knee, what we're doing is we're telling the compressor to stay very close to this ratio setting that we've picked. When we have a soft knee, we're saying, okay, get the ratio somewhere in the general range of where we applied the ratio. So a little more flexibility. We know what attack and release are. Remember, threshold is adjusting volume, so that's set in decibels. Attack and release are set in fractions of a second. We know what the input gain is. The makeup gain can also be called the output gain. Makeup gain are essentially the same thing. But this compressor has a new control, and that's called a filter. Okay, what does that do? We have a low cut and a high cut filter. And what this does is it controls what portion of the audio the compressor is listening to and what it wants to react to. If you watched my Splain'ing EQ, you would have heard me talk about how the low end frequencies have more power and more drive and they're more important. Well, because of that, when a compressor is listening to a piece of audio, the power of the low end will make the compressor react more to the low end than it does to the rest of the audio. And sometimes that's not a good thing. So if we apply this filter, we can tell the compressor at what level should you start listening to the audio, and essentially don't listen to anything below this cut level. So in this instance, we told the compressor, ignore anything down at 144. Don't listen to it. Only react to everything above that. We have a similar high cut that we can use, but the low cut in many instances is much more important. So remember, this does not affect what we're hearing. What it affects is what the compressor is reacting to. And in this case, we're telling the compressor, do not react to any low end. All right? Now, as I bring up the volume a little bit, we'll hear that we're listening to the same song that we've been using throughout this demo. But in this case, I've cut out the vocal. Thank goodness, you don't have to listen to me sing anymore. And I made two tracks. One I'll call the mix minus electric, and the other one is the solo of the electric. So let's just hear, let's solo the mix. So in the mix, we've got bass, drums, acoustic, piano. And here's what the electric sounds like soloed. Now, as we listen to this, we have to determine if or what compression we might apply and why. We need to have an intention, a purpose. So when we talked about limiters, we talked about increasing volume or eliminating clipping. We don't have any clipping on this track. No need to adjust the volume with compression. So we don't need to fix anything. But what we may want to do is enhance and shape the tone of this track to some degree. When I recorded this, my intention was to have an aggressive electric track kind of driving beneath everything else. So let's bring the mix back in. And you can hear that electric guitar in there driving. Dun, 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 dun. All right, so given that we want this electric guitar to be what I'm going to call punchy, let's see if we can use compression to make it more punchy. All right, so what I did earlier was I went in and I made some adjustments, and I made a preset called Aggressive Punchy. And I'm going to solo the electric guitar, and I'm going to turn this compressor on and off. So here it is, no compression. Already kind of aggressive and punchy. Now I'm going to turn the compression on, and you hear those initial peaks, those initial transients, tick, 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 they're much more pronounced. I'll turn it on and off again. Let's listen to that in the track and see if we can hear that in the track. I'll turn it off first, and we'll bring the track in. So train your ear to listen for the electric guitar in this mix. Now we'll engage the compressor on the electric guitar. Turn it off. Even though the electric guitar is punchy, it's sitting in the mix rather mildly. If we engage the compressor with those aggressive, punchy controls, we'll certainly hear it punch out more in those initial transients. Hopefully you can hear that. Now, earlier I talked about this low cut filter, and you can see that I've got it engaged here. And I'm going to turn this on and off, and I'm going to solo this, and I'm going to turn this filter on and off and see if you hear any difference. Now, to my ear, when this filter is on, we're getting a little more low end, a little more bass. I'm going to turn it off, turn it on, see if you hear the same thing. Okay, hopefully you hear that. With the filter engaged, we hear more bass. That seems counterintuitive because we have a low-cut filter on and we're cutting bass out. Well, remember what I said. we told the compressor, do not compress any low end. Consequently, with the filter on, we're hearing more of the low end, and the compressor is not compressing it. Let's turn it off. And now we hear more of it because the compressor is not compressing the low end. I'll walk you through briefly some of the other changes we made here to get this punchy attack. We set a relatively low threshold. We're way down here, and we're getting a considerable amount of compression. We set a pretty aggressive ratio at 15:1, and we set an aggressive knee, a very sharp knee, to make sure we're staying at that 50:1. We've got a relatively slow attack, which means it's letting those initial transients through. That's why we're hearing them. And the release is also set fast. And we've got this filter engaged. Okay, now let's bring up this other visual so we can look at the before and after. Again, yellow's before, pink is after. Let me turn off the compressor. Both of these should look the same, yellow and red. Now when I engage this compressor, you should be able to see exactly what I'm talking about. These initial transients, these big peaks, have gotten much taller compared to when we had without the compressor. You should also notice that the combination of the slow attack and the fast release has not only changed the waveform at the initial transient, but also as the audio progresses, the shape of the rest of the waveform is also changed. What happened? The whole waveform got smaller. Why? Because the low end is so powerful, it's telling the compressor do much more compression, consequently making the whole waveform smaller. We turn the filter on, everything grows. So let's listen to this again, one more time, in the mix. I'll turn the compressor off on the electric. It's still there, we hear it punching through. But when we engage it, it gets much more punchy. Okay, that concludes this first demo of the electric guitar. We're going to move on to a few more examples. Alrighty, we're back at it. Our next project here is to compress the acoustic guitar. Going to solo that. Turn the compressor off. And no need to orient you to the controls. We're using the same compressor we did in the electric example. We have the before and after level meters. And a little later on, I'm going to bring your attention to those. It'll demonstrate the effect of the compression. So, our intention with this project is to try to level off the acoustic in the mix. And when you listen to this, you'll hear that even though this is a rhythm guitar for all practical purposes. It's also sort of following along with a melodic piece that goes dee 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 dee, hear that sort of a thing. But nonetheless, in the last exercise, we wanted to make the electric guitar a little more punchy, a little more spiky. And in this instance, we're going to try to do the opposite. Reduce the punchiness of the acoustic and make it sit down and sit in a mix a little more mildly, a little more mellow. So I'm going to turn on the compressor. As I've done before, I've created a preset. I'm calling it acoustic level. And I'll tell you what I've done here. We've set the threshold relatively low. We've got the ratio at a moderate level at 8.5 to 1. We got a soft knee, again meaning that when we apply this ratio, the soft knee will allow it to float in a general range of 8.5 to 1 rather than making that specifically at a particular number. The attack is pretty fast. The release is slow. I've added a little bit of input gain. And we want this 100% in the mix so we can hear all the changes that we're making. And now, as I said, I want to bring your attention over to the two level meters. We can see that the before, it's peaking a little higher than the after. But more importantly, what we see is, after the notes are strummed, we see a big drop-off in the volume. So this has a lot more dynamic range in it. The big peak, the spike at the transient, then it falls off and goes way low. With the compressor engaged, we see that our dynamic range is considerably smaller. And generally speaking, that has a tendency to level off the volume throughout the piece. So we'll look at that one other way. I'll bring up this before and after using this color chart with the oscilloscope. And I'll turn the compressor off. Let's look down here at the yellow and the pink. And we see that the before and after should be the same. Now, when I engage the compressor, we'll see that the fast attack and the aggressive compression is reducing the size of those those initial peaks. They're much smaller. And additionally, we see that in the before, we get a big spike and then it trails off. A spike and it trails off. On the after, the spike is lowered, but it doesn't trail off quite as much. Those notes are ringing out much longer than they are up here, essentially leveling off the volume as the acoustic plays. Now this might be a little harder to hear than what we did with the electric, because that was rather dramatic, the change we made there. But hopefully you will be able to hear this. I'm going to turn the compressor on and off, try to train your ear on the acoustic as I turn it on and off. Off again. One more time on. Okay, I think we've accomplished our goal here. We've leveled off the acoustic guitar in the mix. Now we'll move on to another instrument. Here we go. Hey, guess what we're working on now? That's right, drums. Let me dial that down a bit. Okay, so I think at this juncture, what I'd like to do is just remind everybody what the purpose of this video is from my standpoint. This is not a tutorial on how you should use a compressor on any given track or any instrument. What this is hopefully an explanation of what compression is, a demonstration of some of the tools available to manipulate compression, and then thirdly, how some of the controls within those tools work and how they vary between each different type of compressor. Those of you who may have experience or knowledge of compressors, perhaps beyond mine, may have an opinion on what I'm doing here, right or wrong. I appreciate that. But keep in mind, I am not trying to suggest that what I'm doing here is the right way or the only way. It's merely a demonstration of how the tools work. So keep that in mind as we proceed. I'm not trying to teach you how to mix or how to do compression. I'm just trying to demonstrate what compression is and how some of the tools work. So having said that, what we're listening to here is a drum track. And this track is a combination of all of the parts of the drum kit. It's the kick, the snare, the toms, the cymbals, the hi-hats, and it's all rolled up into a drum bus. And that's what we're using for this demonstration. So any changes, anything we do with a compressor is compressing the entire kit, not any individual part of the drum kit. I suppose if I was doing this on a song of my own, I might be more inclined to apply compression as needed to any one of the individual kit components. But for the purposes of this demonstration, we're using the drum bus. Okay? Now, previously we were using this stock compressor from Studio One, and we may come back to that. But for the moment, I'm going to put that off on the side, and I'm going to introduce you to a different compressor. This one is also found in Studio One. It's a stock compressor, but it's in something called their Fat channel. So if you find the Fat channel in your effects drop-down, you will see that once you're in it, it has a number of different types of compressors. I've chosen to use what is referred to as a FET, F-E-T compressor. What does that mean? FET stands for Field Effect Transistor. Okay, who cares? Well, I don't know if anybody cares, but what that means is when they built these, the original analog physical units, the electronics that control the compression are managed by transistors. What does that mean to us? The transistors have a tendency to react very quickly to the audio. So consequently, the behavior we expect with a FET-style compressor is very fast attack times. That's what they're known for. That usually gives us a very quick and punchy style compression. One of the most famous FET-style compressors is an 1176. I suspect you may have heard of that. And this appears to be an emulation of an 1176, so we will treat it as if it were an 1176. Alrighty? Now, we said whenever we apply compression, we should have an intent. What is it we're trying to do with the compression? So we're going to find that out by bringing up the mix. Let's hear how the drums sit in the mix. Well, from my perspective, they're sitting pretty well. I like what they're doing in the mix. But I'm asking myself, can I give them a little more life? Can I give them a little more energy? Can I make them a little more prominent in the mix? And I think we can by applying compression. So let's turn on this FET style compressor and walk you through the controls, because this is the first time we're looking at this. So we have here input. Makes sense. The more we dial it up, the louder it gets. Here's the output, or otherwise known as makeup gain. So the audio comes in, we apply some compression, and then we adjust the output with the output or makeup gain. Here, excuse me, we have the attack, and the slowest attack we have here is 8 milliseconds. And way over here, the fastest is 0.02 milliseconds. Very fast. So I'm going to call this fast and super fast. Excuse me again. On the release, the fastest is 50 milliseconds, way over here, and the slowest is 1.1 seconds. All right. Now, one of the unique things about this style compressor is it has no threshold setting. Okay? Whenever we apply compression, we need a threshold to determine at what level do we want the compression to start working. Well, with this style compressor, what we do is we adjust the input gain. And as we dial up the input gain, we increase the gain, it sets automatically a compression level, or I should say a compression threshold. Let me dial up the output a little bit so we can hear this. As we dial up the input, we're doing more compression. As we dial down the input, we're doing less compression, because it is automatically setting a threshold. So let's look at some of the behavior down here in the oscilloscope. We can see at this level we have really large peaks. And if we dial up the makeup gain, things get too loud, we start clipping. If we dial it back, it's in control. And look at the shape of the after. What we see is really tall and narrow spikes, transients, and then not quite as much of the drums ringing out afterwards. Okay? So, again, the input is twofold. As we increase the input, it starts to engage the threshold. Now, the other thing about this is, on the previous compressor, we had a dial where we could select the ratio, 4:1, 8:1, so on. On this one, we do that with buttons. So we've got 4:1, 8:1, 12 to 1, 20 to 1. But the story goes that back in the day when these compressors, the actual rack units, were in the studio, either on purpose or by mistake, the engineer pressed all the buttons in and they liked what they got. What they got was a very crunchy style of compression, so later models included something called the all-in button. And as you can see, all these ratios light up, and it changes the nature of the compressor by adding this very gritty style of compression. So watch this meter here. At these settings, we're doing about 10 decibels of compression. If I dial back the input, you'll see that this starts to fall off. And even if I dial up the output, we still see we're not doing quite as much. When we dial up the input, much higher levels of compression, and then we need to adjust the output so that we're not clipping. All right, so let's turn this compressor off, and let's bring up our old friend, this stock compressor, and we'll try something else here. We're familiar with all the controls, so let's turn it on. And in this instance, we've got threshold set fairly low at -35. We have a moderate level of ratio set at 4.5 to 1. We have a mild knee. The attack is relatively slow. The release is also relatively slow. And we can see the amount of compression we're getting. So I'm going to make up a little gain here so this output matches the input. But so far, to my ear, with these settings, we really haven't done much to change the character of the sound. Let me turn it off and back on. A little bit. We may have pushed it back a bit, but what I have found is the magic in this compressor is applying these filters. So I'm going to turn the filters on, and I'm going to work with the low cut filter first. And listen carefully what happens, particularly to the kick drum, as we engage the low cut filter. Hear that? As we tell the compressor stop compressing the low, right about around here, we really hear that kick becoming more prominent. And we can increase it even more by telling the compressor, don't listen to any of the low end. That kick is really prominent now. I don't think I want that. So let's put that back. I kind of like that. But now what we're going to do is we're going to turn that off. And in previous examples, we didn't really mess around too much with the high cut, but we will here. Let's do the same thing with the high cut. Let's bring it in and see what changes we hear. Hear anything? Let's go back. To my ear, as we bring this high cut further and further down the frequency range, it gets to a point at which we're hearing more and more the snap of the snare and perhaps a little more of the cymbals. You hear that snap? I want some of that, so I'm going to set it right about there. And then I'm going to bring this low cut back in and bring in more of the bass, the kick. So here we go. Without applying any external EQ, we have applied EQ to what the compressor is hearing, and consequently, it's spitting out a completely different style of compression. We are now up here at the level where we are clipping, so I'm going to bring the output gain down a little bit. And I'm going to say, I like this. Let me bring up the mix a little bit. I'll turn the compressor off. Back on. I like what we've done here. The kick's got more meat to it, and we're hearing more of the snap of that snare up there. So I think we've accomplished the goal. We'll shut this off, and what we'll do now is I will bid you a fond adieu to part 2 of Splain'n compression, and in part 3 we're going to move on to compressing vocals. I want to save a whole segment for the vocals because vocals are so important. So thanks for watching part 1 and part 2. See you in part 3 when we attack vocals.